originally was to be the new Cold War, and what the distinguishing features are of the Cold War since 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. But the Cold War is really an exercise in American empire. And I think that if you're looking at the dynamics of the American empire, they're very similar to empires throughout the ages. And one of the leading characteristics is that empires don't pay. They obviously don't pay when they destroy their enemies, but they also bleed their allies. And in the end, they impoverish their home population as well. The population at home suffers. So the guiding dynamic of empires is asset stripping, first their opponents, then their allies, and then their domestic population. And that's the common aim of an empire. The first objective, obviously, is to conquer foreign lands and seize their wealth and their money. But that involves creating alliances and arm-twisting allies to make them bear the cost of the imperial war-making, always called defense. Like America is insisting that its allies share the costs of NATO and back it when it attacked the Near East, Iraq, Libya, and other countries. But it not only does the imperial power exploit the allies for military defense, it insists that they subsidize the imperial nation's domestic affluence and public spending programs. So the resulting internal strain develops. It becomes a war on two fronts. You're pressuring allies as well as your enemies until it's really unclear who's being most exploited. I think preventing other countries from keeping the fruits of their labor and land and resources in their own economies and preventing them from raising their own living standards requires political meddling and political interference. Because obviously, if other countries are democratic and have their own freedom, they're going to want to keep their own prosperity at home. So any empire has to rule through client oligarchies. It has to back rulers in these countries that represent really the imperial power's interests, the U.S. interests, not that of their own countries. So the alliance becomes more and more coercive, and it drives foreign countries to withdraw from the imperial system. And once you withdraw, you become an enemy, because either you're in the empire or you're out. As George Bush said, either you're with us or against us. And since the end of World War II, U.S. diplomacy has created a tributary system that transfers wealth and affluence from other countries to itself. It has become faddish to characterize this as a Thucydides problem, as if America is jealous of China somehow, and as if it's inevitable that there's a war between a rising power and an established power. And the established power usually makes war on the rival, but the Americans who developed the idea of Thucydides' problem did it really to trivialize what the conflict between China, Russia, and other countries outside of the US sphere is all about. It's a false analogy that trivializes the US opposition to China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries that resist the American takeover of their natural resources and their drive to privatize their infrastructure, just as if, well, we're a little jealous and we want to control them. But that's what really is at issue is a conflict of political systems. And the conflict is over whether countries should be privatized and private rent-seeking will be made tax-free and relying on U.S. banks and U.S. Treasury to create essentially foreign reserves, or whether countries are going to be independent. And demanding tribute, demanding that American firms have to invest and own the leading sectors of foreign countries, their raw materials, their land, their technology, is not really rivalry, and it's not jealousy. It's not that America is jealous of countries it wants to exploit. It wants to subjugate them. It just wants to take them over. So in today's world, the way that you achieve subjugation of opponents is more financial than military. They don't do it by an army. They do it by financial takeover. The Soviet Union did not understand this in 1991, when it let the United States advisors create its neoliberal shock therapy. That was voucher privatization, giveaways, kleptocracy, appropriating and selling Soviet resources to American investors and financiers. I don't think the Russian and post-Soviet victims understood how their economies were being defeated by being privatized and financialized and made dependent on dollar diplomacy. The appropriate analogy, if you're going to talk about the Thucydides problem, the appropriate analogy with ancient Greece is the war between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century. And it was an existential conflict between oligarchy and democracy. It wasn't a rivalry between politically similar city-states. They were quite different. Sparta was the leading protector subsidizing Greek oligarchies. It had turned its neighboring Messenia population into serf-like helots. They were forced to produce a crop surplus to feed a militarized, non-commercial, and even non-monetized citizenry in Sparta. What Sparta opposed wasn't Athenian prosperity, so it wasn't jealous of prosperity, it shunned it. It very carefully avoided any show of prosperity within Sparta itself. What it opposed in Athens was democratic reform. It feared that this might be contagious and that democracy might spread, and there goes the Spartan oligarchy. Now, under Solon in Athens in 594 BC, Athens had been one of the last Greek city-states to end debt slavery. Soon thereafter, Pisistratus and his sons developed the Athenian public sector, public spending to employ Athenians, and the economy was further democratized in the 5th century under Pericles and Ephialtes. Athens backed other democracies through what it called the Delian League, based on the sacred island of Delos. Just as in modern times, people will have the United Nations offices in Switzerland or in somewhere in Geneva, somewhere not in the empire's core. Athens had organized its alliance through the Delian League. But the system became exploitative. As Athenian demands for support in military support and the cost of building its ships to oppose Sparta, allied city-states had to pay the costs. And Athens is doing what the United States does when it taps its allies for military support in NATO and the coalition of the willing to take over Iraq and fight other countries or boycott their exports that are targeted by US officials. So the Thucydides problem and the clash of civilization theory both neglect the strains that were caused by Athenian attempts to create an empire to rival Sparta's oligarchic alliances. Thucydides, who was a general for Athens and also wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War that we all had to read in college, wrote, "The whole Hellenic world, that is the Greek world, was convulsed as struggles being everywhere made by particular chiefs being in the Athenian Democracy League or the Sparta's Achaean League. Macedonia and Delphi were part of the Spartan-Persian alliance, and they were opposed by the Delian League, and the treasurers of the Delian League were all Athenians, and they financed as much as 2/3 of Athens' public budget just from its allies by the annual tribute of about 400 talents originally. That's a large amount of silver. Now, this tribute from its allies enabled Athens to avoid imposing new taxes on its own citizens. The money was paid in the form of Athenian owls. Athenian silver coins had an owl on them. That was the symbol of Athens. And they were the dollars of their day. They were the most typical silver coinage. And they were minted at Athens' own mines. Right near Athens, there was a mineral area called Laurium, and that produced the silver that Athens could make its own coinage from. So it didn't have to earn foreign exchange to pay mercenaries and to build ships and to pay its population. It was able to create its own money. And in that sense, also, Athens was like the United States, which simply prints its own money and creates its own money. It doesn't have to earn it abroad. Now, the Parthenon in Athens, up on the hill, the great Athenian public architecture, was built largely with Delian League tribute from 447 to 432 BC. And by about 425 BC, Athens had tripled the Delian League's annual tribute to over 1,200 talents. That is, you can think of it as a ton of silver a year. And this continued until finally Athens was defeated by Sparta in 404 BC, which is when the Peloponnesian War ended. So in the face of this Athenian democratic imperialism, that's what it was called, because Athens was democratic, but was also imperialist towards its allies, less prosperous cities were unable to avoid a debt crisis. And some cities, like Corcyra, were going into debt crisis. And I'm going to quote what Thucydides wrote about Corcyra in 427 BC. He said, during the 7 days that an Athenian general backed the democratic faction against the oligarchs, stayed with 60 ships, the Corcyrians were engaged in butchering those of their fellow citizens whom they regarded as their enemies, namely the oligarchs. And although the crime imputed was that of attempting to put down democracy, some were also slain for private hatred, others by their debtors because of the monies owed to them. And in the next century, throughout all of Greece, there was a constant war between debtors and creditors. The creditors won, assassinated or killed the pro-debtor advocates, and Greece ended up an oligarchy. Now, much of the U.S. diplomacy that propped up General Pinochet in Chile and similar terrorist regimes and dictatorships throughout Latin America, Sparta installed the notorious 30 tyrants in Athens after its victory in 404. Already in 411, Athens' own oligarchs had sort of taken over and appointed a consul that said, we don't want to have to pay our taxes to support social programs. We don't want to spend on the democracy. We want to keep all the money for ourselves. Well, they were overthrown, but then Sparta put in an utterly corrupt regime, which is what oligarchic empires do. You put in client oligarchies. So what happened, the defeat of Athens in 404 BC saw what had been a democracy evolve into an oligarchy. And as much as what happened in the United States after the Vietnam War. And in addition to being oligarchic, the United States is like Sparta in backing client oligarchies abroad. There also are economic parallels. Sparta lived by military subjugation of the Helot population that I described.